I walked into the church wearing a dress that cost more than my college tuition, but I felt like I was walking toward my own execution. My mother stood by the altar, her eyes gleaming, not with tears of joy, but with the cold, hard calculation of a woman who had finally closed the biggest deal of her life. She didn't see a daughter. She saw a walking paycheck that was going to save her from the mountain of debt she'd hidden from me for years. As the music started, I realized that the man waiting for me at the end of the aisle was old enough to be my father, and he looked at me like a trophy he'd just bought at an auction. I had the signed annulment papers hidden in my bouquet, ready to burn her world down the moment the I do's were done. I need to know, was I wrong for waiting until the very last second to destroy her life? Or would you have let her sell you out just to keep the family name intact? To understand how I ended up in that white silk cage, you have to understand my mother, Evelyn. Growing up, our lives were a carefully constructed stage play. We lived in a house that looked like a museum, wore clothes that were always perfectly pressed, and attended every high society event in the city. But it was all a lie. My father passed away when I was 10, leaving us what we thought was a massive inheritance. Evelyn, however, had a taste for luxury that eclipsed any bank account. By the time I graduated from university, the inheritance was a hollow shell. She had spent it all on designer handbags, European vacations, and maintaining the image of a wealthy widow. I didn't know this at the time. I was too busy trying to build my own life as a graphic designer, living in a small apartment and trying to be independent. But Evelyn wouldn't have it. She started introducing me to men, wealthy, older business associates who smelled like expensive cigars and desperation. I laughed it off at first, thinking she was just being a typical, overbearing mother. Then came Arthur. Arthur was 62, a real estate mogul with 3 ex-wives and a reputation for being a shark. My mother started inviting him to dinner every Sunday. She'd spend hours critiquing my hair, my makeup, and my lack of ambition, telling me that a girl like me needed a provider to truly shine. One night, I overheard them talking in the study. My mother wasn't just suggesting a date, she was negotiating. She owed Arthur over $2 million in personal loans and failed investments she'd made using him as a guarantor. The marriage was the repayment plan. He wanted a young, beautiful wife to show off at galas, and she wanted her debts erased and her lifestyle secured. To make matters worse, she began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare. She would come to my office and weep in front of my colleagues about her failing health, knowing I would be forced to take her home to avoid a scene. Once we were behind closed doors, the tears would vanish, replaced by a sharp, venomous tongue. She told me that my father would be ashamed of my selfishness. She claimed that the creative accounting she'd done wasn't just a mistake, it was a desperate attempt to keep me in private schools and luxury. She made me feel like every penny I had ever spent was a debt I owed her, a debt that could only be paid in skin and soul. When I confronted her, she didn't even deny it. She sat me down, squeezed my hand with her cold, manicured fingers, and told me that if I didn't go through with it, she would lose the house, she would be humiliated, and she might even face legal trouble for some of the creative accounting she'd done with my father's remaining assets. She played the victim, crying about how she did everything for me and how this was my turn to save the family. I felt a mixture of pure rage and sickening guilt. For weeks, she manipulated me, using every emotional trigger she had. She told me I was selfish, that I was letting her drown, and that Arthur was a good man who would take care of us both. I felt trapped, like a bird in a golden net. Every time I tried to say no, she'd have a heart episode or show me another past due notice that would end our lives as we knew them. I started to see the walls closing in. The pressure became physical. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and my hair began to fall out in clumps from the sheer stress of her daily interrogations. But then I found her private ledger. I had gone looking for my birth certificate in her safe, but I found something far more valuable. She wasn't just paying off debt, she had negotiated a monthly allowance for herself that would continue for 20 years as long as I stayed married to Arthur. She had even itemized the value of my youth and beauty against her outstanding loans. She wasn't saving the family, she was selling me into domestic servitude to fund her retirement. That was the moment the sadness turned into a cold, hard desire for justice. I decided to play along. I let her pick the dress, the flowers, the venue. I let Arthur buy me a ring the size of a grape. I smiled for the cameras and the engagement photos. I made them believe I had finally broken, that I was the dutiful daughter they could control. I even sat through grueling premarital meetings with Arthur's lawyers, signing papers I knew would be useless once the truth came out. Every time I felt like screaming, I would remind myself of that ledger. I would remind myself of the way she looked at me, not as a daughter, but as a commodity. So that's the situation I was in, sold like a piece of property by my own mother to a man I loathed, all to fuel her greed. I had to make a choice between my freedom and my mother's entire existence. Before I tell you how I burned that wedding to the ground and what happened to the money, I want you to pause right now. Go to the comments and tell me, what would you have done? Would you have sacrificed your life for your mother, or would you have let her face the consequences of her own greed? Let me know, because I'm still processing if my revenge went too far. The day of the wedding was a circus of vanity. Evelyn was in her element, bossing around florists and sipping champagne, acting like the queen mother of the year. She came into my dressing room and told me how proud she was of me, and for a second, I almost felt sick enough to vomit. She actually had the audacity to tell me that one day I would thank her for providing me with such a stable future. But I just smiled and touched the bouquet where the papers were tucked away. I had spent the last month working with a private investigator and a lawyer. I hadn't just found the ledger, I found evidence that my mother had forged my signature on several loan documents to secure money from Arthur months before the wedding was even a topic of conversation. She had committed identity theft against her own daughter, using my credit score to prop up her failing vanity. As I walked down that aisle, every flash of the photographer's camera felt like a countdown. When we reached the altar and the priest got to the part about if anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined, I didn't wait for a guest to speak. I stepped forward. I didn't scream. I spoke with a clarity that silenced the entire room. I told the happy couple and the 300 guests exactly how much I was being sold for. I pulled out the copies of the forged documents and the ledger pages and handed them directly to Arthur's lawyer, who was sitting in the front row. I looked Arthur in the eye and told him his purchase was contested and that he'd been defrauded by a woman who was even more of a shark than he was. The room erupted. My mother's face went from a mask of triumph to a ghostly mottled gray. She tried to grab my arm, whispering for me to sit down and stop the nonsense, but I shook her off. I told the room that there would be no wedding, no merger, and no more lies. I watched as the wealthy socialites she had spent years growling to whispered behind their silk fans. I watched as Arthur, a man who prided himself on never being cheated, turned a shade of purple I didn't know was humanly possible. I walked out of that church, stripped off the veil in the middle of the street, and got into a waiting car. The aftermath was a total collapse of her carefully built world. Arthur, realizing he'd been played and that his contract was built on forgery, immediately pulled all his financial support. He didn't just stop the wedding, he sued my mother for the return of every cent he'd loaned her, plus damages. Within 2 months, the house was under foreclosure. All those friends she had spent decades trying to impress disappeared the moment the scandal hit the local papers. She lost everything, the jewelry, the cars, the status. But the humiliation didn't stop there. Because I had the evidence of the forgery, the police got involved. To avoid jail time, she had to sign over the very last of her hidden assets, a small trust fund my grandmother had left that she hadn't been able to touch, just to settle the civil suits. She's now living in a small one-bedroom apartment in a part of town she used to scoff at, working a retail job just to keep the lights on. She has to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day, the same feet she once refused to put in anything less than $500 shoes. She sends me emails every week, sometimes begging for forgiveness, sometimes cursing me for ruining her life. She tells me she's lonely, that the cold in her apartment gets into her bones, and that she has no one to spend the holidays with. I don't answer. I sold the engagement ring, which Arthur didn't even bother to ask back because he was too busy fighting my mother in court and probably didn't want the reminder of his own gullibility, and used the money to start my own design firm. I moved to a different state, changed my number, and finally have the life I wanted, built on my own terms, far away from the shadows of her greed. I finally found peace in the silence of my own home, a home that isn't built on lies or stolen money. I realized that blood doesn't give someone the right to own you, and sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let the people who are drowning you finally sink. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of emotional suffocation she put me through, making me believe I was nothing more than a tool for her comfort. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see a walking paycheck. I see a woman who survived a predator who happened to be her mother. I know some people say I should have handled it privately, but after years of being her puppet, I felt like the world needed to see the strings being cut. My mother chose money over her own child, and in the end, she lost both. It's a harsh lesson, but one I think she needed to learn. If there is a moral here, it's that your loyalty should never be a blank check for someone else's dysfunction, especially not your parents. You are not responsible for the debts of those who did not value you. Like this video if you think I made the right call by exposing her at the altar, and definitely subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people finally standing up for themselves. Do you think I should eventually forgive her, or is some betrayal just too deep to move past?